Welcome again to Garden Wise Adventures. Today we're going to talk a little bit about soil fertility and a bit more about compost. What is soil fertility and why is it important to your plants? When I started landscaping, I was in California and I wanted to grow some tomatoes. So I just threw some tomatoes in the ground and was highly disappointed when they didn't grow. So I did a little bit of research and found out that you had to add fertilizer. So I did that the next year. It helped a little bit. But then I went and found out about compost. The way I found out about compost is I joined a garden club. It's before Facebook. I'm old. It was before Facebook and anything like that. So we would actually meet together at the library. And they brought in a guy named Andrew Lopez. I haven't heard much about him since, but he talked a lot about living soil. And that fascinated me. So I have spent 20 years looking at soil and how the plants relate to it. And there's so much information out there. We're not going to be able to touch on all of it. I have written a few blog posts that are on my website, and I'll link that below, about soil fertility and different things that go along with it. You need to look at things like your macronutrients and micronutrients. What are macro and micro? Well, you can research that and look it up. But in short, the macronutrients are the nutrients that are available the most and are needed the most by plants. For example, there's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the three major ones that people hear about. There's also calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And they do different things for plants, and the plants look different when they're deficient in those. You can also get too much of those nutrients and cause toxicity in plants, so you have to be careful. There's micronutrients. The most well-known is iron. And there's a lot of other ones. And they're also very important to plants, but they're available in smaller quantities in the soil, and the plants take up smaller amounts of them. So what do you need to do? How do you know which nutrients your plants need? How do you know what you need to add? If you look on YouTube, if you look on websites, there's a lot of people just talking about all the different fertilizers and things that you need to pour into your soil. But how do you know what your individual soil needs? And the answer is soil testing. Don't guess. Don't go with just what everybody else says, because you don't know if they're from your area of the country. You don't know if it's going to work on your property, what your property needs. So take samples of your soil and send it into your nearest extension service. Here in the state of Utah, that's USU. I'll link down below where you can send your soil testing. BYU also has that. But get your soil tested and see what you need. You don't know if you have too much of a nutrient or if you actually need a nutrient. One that you'll need the most is nitrogen. Nitrogen is mobile in the soil, and people tend to need more of that, to add more of that than any other nutrient. So what's the best way to add nutrients? You can go to the store, you can purchase bags of fertilizer, or you can add compost. So let's talk a little bit about compost. Let me show you my pile. Here are my compost piles. They're built very cheaply. Actually, they were free, except for the rebar. The rebar was just a couple of dollars. But I went and found old pallets that people were throwing away and used those. When I was in California, I did not have any sort of containment system. I just had an area of the property where I just put everything on the ground. I tend to make compost easy because I don't have a lot of time. The most important thing you need to remember about compost is what you put in it. You need about 25 to 30 parts of carbon to 1% nitrogen. Now, what is carbon? Let's go look and see what I have in my compost pile that is carbon. As you can see in here, there's some leaves and sticks. The majority of my compost is fall leaves that have fallen. You've seen how many trees I have on my property. When I pile all the leaves in these compost bins, you can see the brown area on the fence. That is how high it's piled up. Now for nitrogen, hopefully this little bee decides to leave me alone. Let's see what we have in here for nitrogen. So here, I've pulled out some lettuce. This is just the old lettuce, some peas. If you look down even further, let's see if I can uncover it. I have some grass, but as you can notice, it's getting a little slimy because there's not enough carbon in this pile. This pile I use as my holding pile. So what I do here in Utah, since I do not have the time I need to produce compost in vast quantities and quickly, so in the fall is basically the only time I really actually touch these piles, other than adding new stuff. In the fall, I'll bring all the leaves up to the top of the hill here, and I will move all the compost over one bin. The compost in the far bin is the finished compost. That I will throw into the trees, under my grapes, into my garden beds, wherever I can. Then I move the next bin over into the finished compost pile. We'll layer leaves first, a thick layer of leaves, a skiff of compost. I'll take about 2 shovelfuls of finished compost, throw those on the top of the layer of leaves, and then I will take whatever greens that I had that had been sitting in this bin all year and put in a layer of those. So basically, in this far bin, I will make a layer, kind of like a lasagna of compost. You can see how far it has composted down in July. I've moved a little bit of the stuff back so you can see what we've produced since November. There's still a lot of mulch in it and stuff like that, and I'll probably filter that out when I use it this fall. And let me see if I can find a worm here. Actually, here's a worm. When I was in California, I could produce compost in a matter of 4 to 5 weeks. What I would do with that is put everything through the chipper shredder so it was already chopped up, a pile of beans and a continuous pile of the chipped browns. And I would layer those with a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer in between, and I would water it, and I would turn it every 2 weeks. And I only had to turn it 2 or 3 times, and I would have finished compost. So you can do compost either very quickly or you could do it slowly. So how does compost work? Plant material, mainly the carbons, are broken down first by your insects, the earthworms, the pillbugs, millipedes. There's a bunch of different insects that work on this compost pile. You don't want to kill the bugs out of your compost pile. They help part of the decomposition. Next comes the soil bacteria. Bacteria is extremely interesting. So let's talk a little bit about bacteria that break down compost piles. They're temperature dependent. So if your compost pile gets up to 160 degrees, there's one type of bacteria that will help in the decomposition. In between, I think it's like 110 and 130 degrees, there's a different type of bacteria that decomposes. Those move off to the side or die off if it gets any hotter. And then there's a different type of bacteria when your compost is cooler that continues to help it break down. So besides the insects and the bacteria, there's also fungi that help break down compost. Compost is amazing. So what does compost do for your soil? Well, number one, compost is full of nutrients. It has some nitrogen, it has phosphorus, it has potassium in it, it has a lot of micronutrients, the iron, the boron, and several different other micronutrients. Those are not in a form that are available to plants when you just stick it on the soil, but continuously releases those nutrients to the plants. So it's a long-term fertilizer for plants. It also helps add body to your sandy soil. It helps it hold the nutrients and hold water. For clay soils, add air pockets and allow for water drainage. It also helps retain water. So compost is vital for your gardens. Let's go over to my gardens and I'll show you what I've done, how I use compost. Just to show you what compost can do for soil, I mixed in 1/3 peat, 1/3 compost, and 1/3 vermiculite. The vermiculite was to help with drainage and water retention. The compost was to add nutrition, and the peat also helped the soil hold water. My soil is very rocky and a lot of clay. I did not mix anything into the soil below, I just layered it all on top. If you look in my hole here, you can see I dug down to where the original layer is, and it looks really healthy and really good. Now I've dug another hole right over here. This is the original soil. So when I talked to you in my first video about soil, I dug a hole in my front yard. This is what the original soil looks like. The sand is topsoil that the original homeowner brought in for the lawn. And then at the bottom of the hole, we have the clay. I have not added compost at all to this. I've just kept it mulched. And we're going to talk about mulch next week. And we'll talk about why this soil, the composition of this soil, has not changed, while 1 foot away, the composition of this soil has changed. And it has to do with moisture, and it has to do with compost. So go ahead and try it. Go out, build yourself a compost pile. You don't have to have a ton of money. Tell me your experiences with compost, and have a wonderful garden adventure.